I wanted to just introduce the California Policy Forum and talk a little bit about the joint effort that we have between Cal Nonprofits and Philanthropy California, which is made up of the Northern California grant makers, Catalyst of San Diego, and Imperial Counties, the Southern California grant makers, and the League of California Community Foundations. So this is a really unique partnership between philanthropy and nonprofits, and allows us to discuss, really current and pressing issues from a couple of different viewpoints, and topics that are important to the sector. So today we are talking about Get Out the Vote, a really timely webinar. We've just had a major election and are looking forward to another one in November. So this webinar will be an opportunity for you to learn from some of the state's best civic engagement teams, as well as some of our national community folks who have a background in civic engagement and particularly getting out the vote for their particular constituents. So Vanessa, you can take us to the next slide. We've got a full deck today of wonderful panelists and real experts in this sector, beginning with Kristen Nimmers. She's the policy and campaign manager from the California Black Power Network. Today, we also have Brian Miller, the executive director from Nonprofit Vote, Luis Alejandro Montero Adams, the executive director of Engage San Diego, Tracy Hudak, the director of field engagement from California for the Arts, and Lisette Escobedo, the VP, the vice president of civic engagement at Ultimed. Really excited to have this wonderful group with us today. And to start things off, I'd like to bring on Brian Miller to discuss his organization, Nonprofit Vote, and talk about some of the work that they do. So with that, I'll leave it to you, Brian, to take it away.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you again to the California Policy Forum for having us on this webinar. This is a really important discussion, obviously. A little bit of background again. My name is Brian Miller. I'm the executive director of Nonprofit Vote, and we are a national organization that really helps provide training and support to nonprofits across the nation to help them build out voter engagement programs to more effectively engage the communities that they serve. We've got free webinars. We do a lot of tailored partnerships. We run a field program, and we also do two other initiatives, Philanthropy for Voter Engagement and National Voter Registration Day, which we manage, which I'll talk briefly about. And, central to all this work, and you can go to the next slide, is really this notion of fostering an inclusive democracy. I mean, that's the underpinning motivator that gets us to do this work. And that we understand that gaps in voter participation along the lines of race, income, age, distort our democracy and the policy debates that flow from it. And that also erodes the influence of nonprofits that are trying to affect public policy. If your community doesn't vote when you're there at the State House, you don't get the same level of attention. And so through a lot of the training and support that we're providing, we're really trying to strengthen the nonprofit sector and the communities that they serve. And again, central to this is really that idea of fostering an inclusive democracy. Now, a lot of folks, then really begs the question, why do we have gaps in voter participation? And policy does play a role, albeit actually a smaller role than many people think. Election policy is important, but what we see is we have huge gaps in voter participation along the lines of race, income, and age, even in the states with the most voter-friendly laws, which tells us there's something else driving these gaps. And you can go over to the next slide, and because part of it is that part of these gaps are really a legacy of people feeling disempowered, feeling like their vote doesn't matter. And that feeling is drawn along those lines of income and education level and so forth, that certain communities are more likely to feel like their opinion doesn't matter for a lot of good reasons in some cases and unfortunate reasons. But it's also very much a reflection of who's being contacted and who isn't. And the good news is these are things we can do something about. We can have deep conversations with people, and we can build out voter engagement programs that really bring them into the table. And then one thing I want to really point out, and this slide here is really one of the things we always try to lift up when I'm talking to groups, is that, we really need nonprofits to step up and do this, because campaigns will not do it. And it's not any fault to them, but political campaigns and candidates, their goal is not to foster an inclusive electorate. Their goal is to win an election, right? That's their whole purpose for existing. They've got limited time, limited money, and a win or lose election a few months away. And so they're going to make strategic choices to only target their voter communications at folks with a history of voting. But what this does is this fuels a negative feedback loop, because they contact, there's people with history that are labeled as unlikely voters. Campaigns focus their attention on other communities, people with a history of voting. These unlikely voters aren't contacted as a result. They're not contacted, they don't vote. They're labeled once again as an unlikely voter. And this cycle just keeps on repeating itself. And unless we build a new civic ecosystem that has a different set of motivators than what political campaigns are, then we're going to keep having these gaps. And you can go over to the next slide here. And this is really what motivates us to support nonprofits across the country. We know that nonprofits do have a fundamentally different goal. Their goal is not to, it's not to win an election. We're doing nonpartisan work. The goal of nonprofits is to make sure the communities that they serve in particular are represented at the ballot box, are represented in elections, that their voice is heard. It's really about the communities that the nonprofits serve, and that really transcends election cycles. It's not about their previous voting history. And if anything, their previous voting history is part of a reason to target those who haven't been voting. And so with that, we really lean into supporting a wide array of nonprofits, including community-based organizations, federally qualified health centers, housing groups, food pantries, as well as civically focused organizations. And what's good about these groups is they have trust. They're in the communities year round. They're not just parachuting in an election cycle. If they're doing their work right, they've got the cultural competency to serve the community that they're in. And they have deep long-term roots in the communities that they serve. And that really gives them an edge. And today, I'm glad to say we have some new research, which I'll share with you. And you'll be the first to see this report because it just came out yesterday. And you can go over to the next slide. Every now and then we do this report we call Nonprofit Power, Building an Inclusive Democracy. And what we do is we run a field program as part of our work. In this case, I think we ran it in 9 states in the last midterm. And so we collected the data from that program. We had targeted data from about 7,000 voters that were engaged across 8 of the 9 states that we were able to match to the voter file. In doing so, we were able to identify the demographics of who the nonprofits reach, as well as their impact on voter turnout. And you can go to the next, actually, before I go to the next slide, when you go to the demographics, it's not going to be a big surprise for those who are in the space, but the communities that nonprofits serve are significantly more likely, at least from the data we've looked at, about 2.5 times more likely to be low income, almost 2.5 times as likely to be communities of color, and also not quite 1.3 times as likely to be younger voters. So significantly more likely to be younger voters as well. But what's more important or equally important is the boost that has on turnout. And you can go to the next slide here. And so looking at that data, we were able to document that the voters that were served by nonprofits voted at 56 percentage points across the states we did the study in, as compared to 46% of comparable voters. And when we say comparable, basically we weighted the numbers to ensure that the comparison group we had was equally demographically similar, so that if 70% of our group was people of color, 70% of our comparison data set was people of color, same for low income, age, et cetera, and geography. Long and short is we were able to document a 10 percentage point boost in turnout from those who were engaged by nonprofits. And among communities of color, it's actually about 12 percentage points, with the highest among Black voters, which I think had either a 14 or 15 percentage point boost. I'd have to go back to the report to find that exact number. But you can go to the next slide. And if you look at that, for those who are in the space, you hear that term propensity, right? Vote propensity. That's that score we were talking about earlier that campaigns use. And so campaigns target their communications at really people with either a medium or high propensity election likelihood. Those with the lowest propensity score, meaning in this case, we grouped them in under 30. But the important thing for us is that the people who were least likely to vote otherwise received the most benefit by being engaged by nonprofits. They saw the biggest gains in voter turnout. And similarly, I think we had a 15 percentage point boost for those earning 20 to 30,000, 14 percentage point boost among young voters in their likelihood of voting. And so, again, this really shows us that the impact of this vote, this work is, and you can go ahead and go over to the next slide. This report, sorry, the slide got a little mucked up, but that's okay. You can either scan this thing or grab the QR code, which I believe was also put in the chat box. You can download this report now, read it over, use it, use it when you go to funders. Say, hey, look, we know this work works. Here's evidence that it works. We want to build out a voter engagement program for our nonprofit. Use it when you make your case to your board about why this work is impactful. It has a real ROI. And so that's the intent of this report. We know we have another report called America's Nonprofits Get Out to Vote, which looks at the share of nonprofits that do voter engagement using data from the Urban Institute. And right now it's about 20% of nonprofits currently do voter engagement. That goes up to about a third of nonprofits when you're looking at nonprofits serving low income. Our goal as an organization is to grow that number, is to support the nonprofits that are doing voter engagement work, and then to expand the share of nonprofits doing it. And you can go into the next slide here. And I just got a couple of resources I wanted to share with folks as a wrap up. As I mentioned, we do free national webinars. We have a Rally the Sector webinar, which is going to be coming up on March 28th with Boulay and a few other key speakers. I don't have the link for that yet, but it will be forthcoming on our website. We also have a Staying Nonpartisan. We just did a Staying Nonpartisan webinar yesterday. We're going to do that same webinar in Spanish. So if you have a Spanish-speaking community that you work with on April 24th, and there's a link for that registration there. We do also a lot of tailored support for partner organizations. We work with Feeding America to build out their voter engagement programs, YWCA, et cetera. And the multi-state field program, which is what we use for the data for this report. And you can just bump over the last slide. And there's two other initiatives that we manage. One of which is Philanthropy for Voter Engagement, which we do in partnership with United Philanthropy Forum, Council on Foundations, and Independent Sector. And it really lifts up. We interviewed a bunch of foundations that are doing good work in the space, and we're really trying to provide a blueprint for funders who want to go into the space and be more supportive of voter engagement work. And the last thing is the National Voter Registration Day, which we are the managing partner of, and encouraging everyone to mark their calendars for September 17th and visit the website to sign up, and you get free posters, stickers, and training guides and other toolkits to support your efforts. And that is everything that I have. And I, again, thank the California Policy Forum for having us on this discussion.
Thank you so much, Brian. Really happy to have you on board as well. And I think, the topics and voice that you present really dovetail well into our next speaker. I mean, that's Luis Alejandro Montero Adams from Engage San Diego. Luis, would you start out by telling us a little bit about Engage San Diego, and then maybe continue on to some of the endeavors and initiatives that you've been a part of?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you for everyone who's joined us. This is a conversation that's really near and dear to my heart. Brian, thank you so much for that overview. I think you've done a fantastic job of kind of laying the groundwork. That is a big picture view, and I think I can kind of provide a little bit more of a honed in perspective. So at Engage San Diego, we've been a nonprofit and fiscally sponsored organization that has been active in San Diego County for 13 years now. We are a coalition of community-based organizations. The way that I explain my role to friends and family members is that I help coordinate voter outreach, but I'm not the person that's actually knocking on doors, making phone calls, or sending out text messages. I'm supporting the 15 community-based organizations that are doing that within their own individual communities. So Engage San Diego was brought together by community-based organizations who wanted to do more voter engagement, but didn't know how to do it or wanted to coordinate the efforts, learn best practices from each other, and ensure that there was no duplication of the efforts that they themselves were doing. We really think about Engage San Diego's mission as doing year-round civic engagement. So during election cycles, during election seasons, there's a lot of ways that nonprofits can get involved with, but that doesn't mean that that effort ends when the election ends. In California, we just had our presidential primary this Tuesday, March 5th. And already we are looking at what the summer activities are going to look like leading up to the general election. And then, of course, we will continue to be active next year during an off election year. Some of the things that we've been doing in San Diego County include participating and leading efforts for the 2020 census, coordinating efforts for redistricting at the city, county, and even statewide and federal levels, ensuring that voter access continues to expand within our region. And then, of course, as I mentioned, leading efforts for Get Out the Vote or GOTV efforts. Really quickly, just wanted to expand on some of those items. In 2020, Engage San Diego led community outreach for the 2020 census as we worked with over 120 community-based organizations to ensure that voters and community members were listening and hearing the messages from trusted messengers. As I said, I'm not leading the outreach efforts myself, but I'm coordinating those efforts with predominantly service-based organizations that have built up relationships within their communities. Some of our partners include organizations like PANA, the Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans, Via Vote, the San Diego LGBT Community Center. These are organizations that are working within their communities and working with specific communities of interest on a year-round basis. They've already built up those relationships. They've already had those conversations with them. So what we're doing is providing them the resources, information, so that they can then continue those conversations, get them involved with the census, with redistricting, registering to vote, reminding them to vote. And throughout the year, they're able to continue to build off of those relationships as trusted messengers and share the information that's critical for civic engagement as that goes on. In San Diego County, we were actually able to raise over $1.5 million for the 2020 census. We were able to lead trainings, share best practices, and what we saw was that after the 2020 census, San Diego County had the single largest increase of any county in California. We went from roughly 69% of census participation in the 2010 census to almost 75% participation in the 2020 census. That 6% increase was because our community members heard the information, heard the messaging from our community partners, and participated in the census because they understood the impact that it was going to have on their communities. That also does represent both a significant gain and highlights that there's still more work to be done. Yes, that 6% increase was fantastic, and it is higher than the California statewide average, but it still means that 25% or 1 out of every 4 households in San Diego County did not participate in the census. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but those have lasting impacts that mean that communities were not counted. Those are oftentimes historically and systematically disenfranchised communities, and those will continue to have impacts for the rest of this decade. That also leads to the work that we did in redistricting. We were able to fight for maps that provided better representation for our communities. We were in San Diego County able to confirm the longest continuous serving LGBTQ identified district in the nation. So in the city of San Diego, District 3 has been identified as the LGBTQ district. In District 4, we had a Black Empowerment District. We were able to solidify an AAPI empowerment district in District 6. These projects in redistricting ensure that our communities have a voice, are heard, and that true representation is possible when major decisions are being made. One small kind of caveat or tangent that I'll make is in the city of San Diego, we have 10 elected officials, 1 mayor and 9 council members who decide the city's budget every year. That is a $5 billion budget every year decided by 10 human beings. At the county, we actually have a over $8 billion budget that is decided on by 5 county supervisors. So between the city of San Diego and the county of San Diego, we have 15 human beings that have been elected to their office that control over $13 billion in funding every single year that impact the lives of almost 4 million residents. It is immensely powerful positions that are impacted by the census, by redistricting, and voter engagement. As a 501c3 and working with 501c3 organizations, what we do is we ensure that voters are contacted by trusted messengers. And with those trusted messengers, our community-based organizations receive support from Engage San Diego. We provide access to the voter files so that we're actually able to reach out to voters, as Brian mentioned, that are oftentimes not targeted by campaigns. It's not that political or candidate campaigns are not interested in reaching out to these what we call low propensity voters. It's that oftentimes these are short campaigns with limited funding. They don't have the financial resources or the time resources to reach out to every single voter. So they choose to reach out to high propensity voters, voters who are more likely to vote in their election. In San Diego County, we are estimating that the final voter turnout for the March 5th primary will be about 37%. That means that 63% or almost 2/3 of registered voters in San Diego County did not submit a ballot. Those low propensity voters are the voters that Engage San Diego and our community partners are reaching out to. We want to make sure that their voices are heard, that they understand what information they need in order to be able to vote and have their voices heard. So we provide access to the voter file. We provide technical support and access to best practices. And then we ensure that the strategy reduces duplication. It's great if a voter hears from multiple organizations, but we want to make sure that as many voters as possible have access to that. So Engage San Diego plays a critical role in low propensity voter outreach during election cycles, but we also play a larger role in ensuring that civic engagement stays active year round. The last thing I'll end with is in a moment where access to voting is being shrunken and truncated across the nation, in San Diego, we're actually expanding it. We're trying to make voting easier. Engage San Diego led the efforts to ensure that the Voters' Right Act was implemented. And just in 2022, we had the first election where that came true. We ensured that every single voter in San Diego County receives a mail-in ballot. We expanded early in-person voting. There are now over 40 vote centers that are open 11 days in advance of the election. Those are 11 continuous days, even on weekends and holidays, so that people can show up, register to vote, and cast their vote all at the same time. In San Diego County, you can show up to any vote center, including on election day, without identification or any other documentation, and cast a provisionary ballot. That provisionary ballot is then confirmed that you are an eligible voter and your vote is counted, meaning that restrictions that are placed on voters outside of California and outside of San Diego County are removed. We want to make voting as easy as possible, and we want to make sure that our community's voices are heard without those limitations. So very excited to hear from the other speakers, but just wanted to give a broad overview of the role that Engage San Diego plays in the bigger spectrum that Brian outlined. So thank you. I'm so sorry. I think you might be muted.
Thank you so much. I was going to say thanks, Luis, and we really appreciated hearing from you, particularly about how to make voting easier for the communities that you're serving. So I'd like to bring on Lisette next for her to speak about Ultimed and describe a little bit about your organization and how they become trusted partners and messengers to provide voting access for the communities that you serve.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Robert. And so I want to start off with like, why is Ultimed on this webinar, right? We're talking about get out the vote, civic engagement. And so just wanted to share a little bit about our history, Ultimed, and who we are. Ultimed is the largest federally qualified health center in the nation. We serve about 500,000 patients. We have about 5,000 staff. Because of our not just our designation as an FQHC, but also the history in this work. We serve amongst the most vulnerable populations in both LA County and Orange County, and hopefully expanding. We believe that access to quality, culturally relevant healthcare is a human right. And so we were established about 55 years ago with our CEO at the helm, Castelo de la Rocha, who was part of the Chicano rights movement and who had this similar view in place as well, that our community should have access not just to healthcare, but to quality healthcare. And so, you know, fast forward from 1969 till now, and our name is Ultimed, you know, have the 500,000 patients, right? 5,000 staff. But really our work in the civic engagement space is also rooted in this sense of equity and social justice for the communities we serve. Next slide. And so I want to take folks on a brief journey about why Ultimed and federally qualified health centers and other community health centers are really positioned to do this work. As part of the services that we provide, we are by design in some of the communities with the highest social vulnerability index. And so when you look at each of these points, these are where all of our clinics are located. And if we go on to the next slide, you know, I will show why we're located in the places where civic engagement work is not something neat to do, is something that's required to do for the health of our communities. And so where our clinics at also happen to be amongst the areas that have been historically undercounted every census, meaning we don't have the resources, right, through federal funding. We often don't get the representation in our communities because we're undercounted. And so when redistricting happens, right, we don't get our fair share. And it often means that historically, right, we continue to be underfunded and underreached. Next slide. And so then we overlay that with where we have the highest percentage of low voter turnout and areas that are considered civic deserts, according to folks in the research space, which are the blue areas. So we are in the areas with the highest social vulnerability index, the areas where folks have traditionally been undercounted, underreached, underfunded, and where we lack representation because folks are often not reached during critical elections and other civic efforts. And so we now have the sense as, or the responsibility as an FQHC to understand that we have to do this work to make the conditions better for our community. And so I share all this because this is a perspective we bring to our FQHC partners as well. Next slide. One of the other overlays that we actually added very recently to this map is also which were the areas that were hardest hit by COVID and where we had least access to vaccinations, testing, et cetera. And guess what? We're in those places. And so when we talk about representation, resources, money, power, right? And then mortality in essence because of health disparities, we are in those communities. And so it was very clear to us that we had to do work that led to transformational change in these communities, that led to having representatives that voiced our concerns and that saw our issues as top priority issues, that we had to make sure that we were represented in numbers by every census. And so this is why we embarked in the civic engagement work. It's this right here, right? This map. Next slide. And so one of the big, and we have this conversation all the time in healthcare, the social determinants of health. And we expand that to say the social and political determinants of health, we've coined this term at UltiMed called civic health. We know that poor civic health affects communities and hinders progress towards improved social outcomes, such as equitable access to quality healthcare, education, and job opportunities, right? And so if we are not consistently active in these systems that create power in our communities, then we can't address all the conditions in these environments that make our communities ill. We can tell our community, we can tell our patient, it's really important that you take a 30-minute walk every day after you get home from work. But if the issue is public safety and no access to parks, it makes it very difficult for that patient to be healthy, right? If we say it's really important for you to take this medication every day at 9 a.m., but they struggle with having housing, any housing at all, then the issue no longer becomes their health. It becomes, I need a place to live. And so we cannot address that 80% of health that is determined by social determinants of health if we're not addressing the power structures that create these environments. Next slide. So that's why we do it. And here's why UltiMed and community health centers are well positioned to do this work. Having been in the civic engagement space myself for about 20 years now, and I'm dating myself, we always did all this research, right? And I'm sure a lot of you do this research around trusted messengers. And consistently year after year, when we spoke to Latino voters, when we spoke to Latino communities about who are the messengers that you trust the most, it consistently comes up as doctors, nurses, and teachers. And so when I had the opportunity to join the UltiMed team, and they shared with me that we have close to 400 providers that are committed to community and want to do this work, I thought, yes, we're in the communities that need it the most, but we also have the most access to messengers in this work. And so we started engaging our providers, our family medical residents in this work because we understood the critical role that they play. And so they are part of our strategy, part of our work to make sure that we're reaching out to community in a way that's culturally relevant. And just to add relevance, right, to the critical role of CHCs, community health centers across the state of California serve about 7.7 million patients. Nationally, they actually serve more than 29 million, serve about 31.5 million. And so imagine if we can take this movement of incorporating civic engagement work into the walls of every community health center. And we had the opportunity to mobilize 31.5 million people in the nation to become civic participants. That is true transformational change. And that's how we view this work. And that is what My Vote, My Health is. Next slide. And so what is My Vote, My Health? My Vote, My Health is our program that we where we integrate civic engagement into the work that we already do. We are 61 sites, right, brick and mortar in the community. And we know we have access to those 500,000 patients that are in some of these most vulnerable communities that I talked about earlier. And so we in essence looked at our entire structure of not only service provision, but our entire structure of how we access community and build relationships with them. And we decided to integrate civic engagement into all those pillars. So one pillar is engaging patients. When you go into our clinics, there's posters, there's handouts. If you go now, because of the 2024 election, you'll see the posters that have the date for the primary and general election. You'll see our staff with My Vote, My Health t-shirts, right? It's messaging embedded throughout. In addition to that, our doctors have badges with a QR code to register to vote so that folks can actually register to vote as they're checking out from their appointment. And then we engage our providers, like I mentioned earlier, and our staff. We have 5,000 staff that come from the communities we serve. And in a certain sense, these are potential champion and advocates that can go back into the community and inspire their whole family to get out and vote. And so we engage them through new hire orientations. In essence, we look at the entire structure and process of communication internally and decide how are we going to embed the message. We're not going to create something new because that's you know, that then becomes a huge lift even for our staff and our providers. We want to integrate the message in this work into what's already existing. And then the third pillar of our work is that we understand that we can talk to the patients, we can talk to our staff, but then we have to send them into the same community that has the same conditions, again, that make them ill. And so we've developed a partnership with civic engagement community-based organizations, Engage San Diego actually being one of our partners in San Diego. And in essence, what we do is we run traditional get out the vote efforts within a 5-mile radius of all of our clinics. As folks know who are in this space, we can't access public health information, so we can't just pick up a a patient database and call everyone. But what we do know is that we can get a sense of where we have patient density. And so we target low propensity Latino voters within a 5-mile radius of each clinic, which is where our patient density is. And we come with the message of get out and vote. We actually have a white coat canvassing day where we take our white coats, we take our doctors to knock on doors. Those are actually our best performing days. And so we do doors, phones, and texts by engaging our staff, engaging partners, and engaging our providers in doing this work. Next slide. And I think that might have been my last slide. But the last thing that I'll mention is that we've created this model since 2018. We've refined it, and we've really been able to engage our staff in a comprehensive and meaningful way. And one of the things that we did this year with the partnership with the California Primary Care Association, and we expanded this model statewide. So we've been training about 11 federally qualified health centers throughout 6 different regions of the state: LA County, Orange County, Sonoma, Santa Clara, and Fresno, so that they too can do this work in their respective community health centers. So we've been training them on having basic conversations around voting, around other civic issues. We've been creating materials that have gone statewide. And so we're really excited because this election, we're actually planning to target 250,000 low propensity Latino voters in these 6 regions using these 3-pillar model that is the model under My Vote, My Health. And so we hope to partner with many of you. We are looking at how we expand this My Vote, My Health integrated civic engagement model nationwide, and also how we work with service providers to look at this integrated model as a way to integrate civic engagement into their service provision process. And so that's a little bit about us, and I'm excited to be here and excited to be with my colleagues on this panel as well.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It's wonderful to hear about the integrated model. And I love the emphasis on involving your staff as well. Moving along, I'd like to bring on Kristen Nemmers from the California Black Power Network. And Kristen's efforts are more of a statewide effort, so they vary a little bit differently from the last 2 speakers we'd heard. And so I'd invite Kristen to share a little bit about your organization and the way that you engage voters in your communities.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. Like you said, Kristen Nemmers. I am the Policy and Campaign Manager with the California Black Power Network. And we are a coalition of over 35 Black-led and Black-serving organizations throughout the state, really working together to change the lived conditions of Black Californians by dismantling systemic and anti-Black racism. And we're in 5 major regions, including the Bay Area, Los Angeles, San Diego, the Inland Empire, and Central Valley. And one of our core focuses as an organization is civic engagement and improving our democratic processes to really ensure that Black communities and people are able to use our power and be part of choosing our decision makers and influencing the policy decisions that are made about our communities. And so we do year-round voter engagement with Black voters, and particularly have a focus on reaching the most impacted communities. So those that are considered hard to reach due to the barriers facing them. And so in our outreach, we're really thinking about and being intentional about, how we reach folks who are unhoused and may not understand how to register without having an address, how we reach folks who are system impacted and may not know whether or not they're actually eligible to vote, since we recently through Prop 17, re-enfranchised over 50,000 folks. How we reach Black immigrants who may have language needs that are not met by the county because they're not kind of in that 12 typical languages that are translated. Low-income communities and other folks, to Brian's point earlier, that we know are not typically contacted by campaigns because they're not considered to be likely voters. And our experience and our engagement with communities has really shown us that people want to vote, people are interested in these processes, but they need to be engaged. And our election processes have really changed in many ways since 2020 and the pandemic. We've implemented the VCA, we have vote by mail ballots for everyone. And it means that, voting locations have changed that folks may have used for many years. And we know also with like the national landscape, with growing poverty, increased houselessness, continued housing affordability crisis, folks are really struggling to survive and many are disillusioned with the process. And so part of the work is not only this outreach, but also motivating and speaking to the issues that are most impacting communities. So, how does your vote impact the resources available for the houseless community? How does your vote impact funding for the schools in your community? Even getting at some of the smaller things that we often hear in like our phone banking, how does your vote impact the potholes on your street? And in addition to that motivation, there also needs to be efforts, in our messaging and in our communication to really uplift that voting isn't the last or only step in seeing changes you want to see in your community. I think part of the reason that folks are really disillusioned is this idea that like I vote and then stuff changes, but we know that that's not often the case. That's not often how it works, and we need to continue to engage even after elections and before elections. And so we also do what we call integrated voter engagement, which is engaging voters not just in the few weeks surrounding elections, but also in off years when there are no elections. And during those civic engagement programs, our organizations are connecting folks to local resources and local organizations. We're updating them and sharing with them other ways that they can continue to engage in issues that they care about. And I think that makes a really big difference in how people we engage view democracy and view their ability to impact it. And additionally, with this kind of same thing in mind, that voting is not like the last or only step. Prior to being the Black Power Network, we were the Black Census and Redistricting Hub. We were focused particularly on doing census outreach and advocacy during the redistricting process to really ensure that like Black communities weren't broken up and districts weren't gerrymandered in ways that intentionally limit political power. And in that work, we were one of the state's partners in doing outreach to Black residents throughout the state. And part of our messaging to folks was that, even this is a part of the process of getting the things that you want changed. Census is a part of this overall journey of democracy where we need to get counted to impact federal funding and to ensure that the population counts are accurate, when they're drawing districts. But then we also need to participate in redistricting process so that it's clear where there are communities of interest and so that our communities aren't broken up and have the ability to elect candidates of choice. And then we vote, but then we still have to continue to engage those we elect. And so the last thing I'll say is that it's just really important that we think holistically about what it means to engage people in our democracy so that we're not just saying go vote, but we're also thinking about what are the barriers that face folks who are low propensity voters? What motivates folks to be interested in voting? What would help them to continue to be engaged even after elections? And I think we're going to throw some resources in the chat, but we have a voting 101 guide on our page that we update according to elections. Folks can also sign up to get our newsletter and join our movement with the Action Network link that we share. And then additionally, just as an organization, we also engage in policy advocacy. And so we've been doing research to really understand the ways that Black folks are impacted in 7 key issue areas. And one of those issue areas is democracy. And so we've identified some of the key disparities that are facing Black folks in democracy and have worked as a coalition to really develop a vision for what an inclusive and accessible democracy would look like, and are also in the process of exploring like what policy solutions can help address these issues. So you can check out some of those materials and the webinar we hosted using those links in the chat. But I'll pass it back to you, Robert.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. I really love your verbiage of the journey through democracy and the emphasis that your organization takes on the holistic approach to voter engagement. It's not just that one time, but it's creating a long-term relationship with your community that begins with maybe a census count and ends with political advocacy. We've heard from a variety of different groups today, particularly those organizations that are engaged in bringing out low propensity voters or marginalized groups. Now I'd like to bring on Tracy Hudak, the Director of Field Engagement from California for the Arts. And Tracy, if you'd be so kind as to tell us a little bit about your organization and the creative community it represents and how you are involved or seek to be involved in voter engagement and civic engagement initiatives.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this and to learn from everyone on the call and on the panel. California for the Arts, we're actually two organizations. California Arts Advocate is the arts, culture, and creative worker lobbying voice in Sacramento, working on policy and funding for our field. And California for the Arts is the statewide advocacy network working to build advocacy capacity for members of our field as well. And we do this through a number of year-round programs and engagement. In particular, April, which you'll see in my screen there, is a state designated Arts, Culture, and Creativity Month, which is also a key month in state budget negotiations. So we activate the state. We have a summit. We have Advocacy Day legislator meetings in Sacramento and virtually. And we have a whole series of media campaigns and other toolkits for local activations to help change the conversation about how artists, culture bearers, cultural organizations, creativity itself are valued in our state, and positioning folks in our field as partners in your work as nonprofits and in other civic and social endeavors. And I'm here primarily with questions that are really at the center of our work. What makes an individual identify their voice, that the issues that they face are shared, that when they say them out loud, they connect and build power, and what does it take to build a network of folks with voice, and what are the barriers? And we try to develop tools and resources and technology and platforms to both create individual activists within our field and build this connectivity amongst networks, and also here to provide insights in how all of you may partner with artists and tradition bearers and cultural spaces in your communities. We're great outside the box thinkers, communicators, and trusted spaces within your communities, and also many arts organizations and artists and themselves have a civic and social practice, so they have this body of knowledge around change and voice empowerment, connecting people, things like that. So I hope to contribute some of that to the conversation as well. And I think and we do toolkits in terms of in election years, how folks can get out the votes, how members of our field can participate in getting folks prepared, engaged in election process. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tracy. Appreciate your thoughts and take there. Now we have a little bit of time set aside for questions. And I'd like to start by bringing all the speakers back on. And then I have a little bit of topics and questions that have come through the chat, as well as topics that have come up during some of our discussions. And I'd like to start by talking about the importance of cross-sectional coalitions and the ability for groups to work together. And I think this is an interesting opportunity for someone, particularly a group, say, like Californians for the Arts. How do they work with groups like Engage San Diego or the California Black Power Network? And I'd open that up to the group if anyone would like to take the lead on that question.
I'll just pipe up and say that I learned from both Lizette and Kristen how important the culture within their communities are to the success of their work, and point that back, and also just flag that we did get a policy win for having the states declare artists as the state's second responders. And that's something that we let our advocates know so that they can build bridges in civic, social, and health spaces in terms of, what services can we provide to help you achieve your outcomes. So.
That's great. Another topic that we all have been dancing around today, but I think is really important, is that of the census. And I think sometimes census work and get out the vote work are thought about as two different endeavors. And I'd like to open it up to the group to talk about your feelings. Are these two different endeavors, or are they very much connected and part of the same initiative? Brian, do you have some thoughts you'd like to share? And you might be on mute.
Sure. Yeah, I think the biggest well, one, they're not separate. Obviously, they're very similar. Well, they certainly have absolutely similar infrastructure, and you can certainly make an argument that they impact each other. Obviously, census district redistricting and census counts affects how legislative districts are drawn. So if communities are undercounted, then they're also underrepresented in the democratic process, and obviously redistricting. And so there's that very direct tie-in that they obviously have, and I think anyone working in the space recognizes. But I think the other thing that we really see a lot of is the infrastructure for doing get out to vote work is almost the same as the infrastructure for doing get out to count work. So, and so we've seen a lot of nonprofits around the country move pretty seamlessly from get out to count work to get out to vote work, because part of it is you're leaning into the trusted relationships that community health centers have with the communities that they serve, right? There's already people coming through the agency every day, whether you're talking to them about getting the importance of the census and getting counted, or whether you're talking to them about the voting process and how they can plug in. It's the same infrastructure you're leaning into, whether across these agencies. So I think on both of those respects, they're very connected.
That makes a lot of sense. Lisette, self-described census nerd, would you chime in here and give us your thoughts on the census and how that plays a big role in your work?
Absolutely. So I actually had the opportunity to run a national census campaign in 2010, then came back for more in 2020. And so, I definitely see census as one of the kind of biggest issues every 10 years, right? So we're talking about three things. One, data, funding, and representation. These are all things that in every sector are critical and important. In healthcare, our federal funding formulas come from census data, right? If we can get an accurate count of our communities, we can get more accurate Medicaid funding, Section 8 funding for our communities, programs for children, programs for new mothers. And so it is a critical component. In voting, we get that through ballot measure policy changes through the leaders we elect. In the census, we get that through census formulas. I think the data piece, right, in order for us to make better decisions about the health and a variety of things for our community, we need accurate data. All the way from determining what's covered under the Voting Rights Act under Section 203, the languages, right, as well as making sure that we understand where the community is located, where there's higher density of particular populations. And the third piece is representation, right? It's the redistricting process is in essence determined by both census data and by who is in office, right, at the state level in many states. And so there is a interconnectedness. The way that we view it is doing voting, get out the vote work, and doing census work are required things to ensure the civic health of our community. And like folks mentioned, right, like Brian mentioned, it is similar infrastructure. I even see it as more opportunity. Why? Because the voting process, we engage folks that are 18 years old, register to vote or can register same day, right, and can vote. The census is everyone. And the trusted voices or trusted messengers play an even more critical role, because we have to engage folks who are in the who are undocumented, who don't understand Title 13 protections. And this is where at least on our end, our doctors can play a huge role, but many of you can play a huge role, and in the folks you engage. So it is not it's not necessarily whether it's similar, it's both are critical work that we have to see as a consistent continuum towards getting folks on the path towards civic health.
I'm sorry, Luis or Kristen, anything to add on census work and engagement?
Yeah, I'll definitely add that I agree on the infrastructure piece. Like, it really is the same. And we're using the same methods of like, how do you integrate some of that outreach into the services that are already provided? Like, some of our organizations work with the houseless community, and in our census outreach, provided like service bags and goods and food, but also said, hey, this is the process that is going on. This is how you can get engaged. And so those are some of those other ways that you think about it more holistically, where like, if we can kind of help folks to meet some of their needs, then they also will be more engaged and more motivated to participate in these processes. So.
Completely agree. And everything that's already been shared is so impactful. The only thing I'll add to this conversation about the census is, specifically in 2020, this was a unique year. I spent all of 2019 and the first 2 months of 2020 preparing for the census, just thinking it was going to be the biggest thing in the world. And 2 days before I was about to open my in-person census support space, I got a phone call and was told that I had to work from home for the next 2 weeks. And of course, April 1st, 2020 was a big date for us in the census, but it also was a bigger date for so many others in our communities who were struggling and fighting through so many spaces. I think one of the big stories and narratives that I take away from it is, in San Diego, yes, we had that massive increase in census participation, but it also provided us an opportunity for us to reach out to our communities and really ask them what they needed. Rising to the moment and connecting the importance of what was happening that day in their lives with the broader scale. We oftentimes, I think Kristen said this perfectly earlier, we talk about voting, or a lot of people talk about voting as that final action, as if, great, you voted, your job is done. And the census for us was really that amplification of that moment. We had a March primary just a few days before, and we were talking to people about the census, about how do you continue this? There are so many actions within our worlds as civic engagement opportunities where we have the opportunity to plug people in. Locally in San Diego, we talk about our budgets that are discussed and approved in June every year. So, now that I've finished voter engagement, now how do we talk about budget engagement? And these are all spaces to both provide opportunities for civic engagement, but also check in with our communities and see how they're doing, how we can continue to support them. And that cycle does not end. We are here in this world because we care passionately about our communities, and we have to provide them this chances and opportunities to have their voices heard. This is just that continuation. So to answer your first question, Robert, yes, these two items go hand in hand, and there are so many other opportunities that I'm excited that we are all talking about and we are all highlighting.
Thanks, Luis. To that end, I'd like to introduce another topic in a lens through which to view the Get Out the Vote initiative. And that is from the point of funders in philanthropy. How can funders in philanthropy be best engaged in this work? And how do they flex their muscle through voter initiative or civic engagement endeavors?
And Robert, if I can jump in on that one. That's a question we really look at when we put together the Philanthropy for Voter Engagement Initiative. And what we did, we went around, we interviewed about 35 or so foundations around the country that were doing good work in the voter engagement space. And not just democracy funders. We're looking at, Kansas Health Foundation, Seattle Community Foundation, California Community Foundation, community foundations, health spend down foundations, private foundations, and a few democracy funders. But we're really focused on how other foundations can do it, and we identified a lot of best practices which are lifted up on the foundation toolkit. Again, philanthropytoolkit.org. some of it is the kind of things you hear, which is, encouraging funders to provide, general support grants, which gets around some of the challenges around voter registration rules, particularly for private foundations. But also providing multi-year investments and providing the funding early. Democracy Fund's pushing this whole all by April, right? Trying to get as much of the money out early in the year as we can. Some of the other things we also look at is identifying, building the capacity for doing this work. And sometimes that means hiring staff out of the organizing space who know the work as program officers for the foundations. Sometimes it means joining a funder collaborative like FCCP or PACE or something, where people can get this kind of institutional knowledge and experience. But we also talk about the rules and know the rules. Learn the rules. We do have a legal guide in the toolkit, which I posted in the Q&A box earlier. Someone was asking about rules for private foundations and public foundations. They do differ, but mostly for very specific things like voter registration or ballot measure work. So for private foundations especially, read the rules and know the rules, but it also means knowing how you can support the work and supporting the work as great as you can within those rules. And I think the last thing we do, I would say, that we lift up in there is at the very least, don't use overly restrictive grant language. Don't have grant language that says, you can't engage in political activity. There's no legal definition for political activity. Is a voter registration drive political? Some may say so. It's don't do partisan political activity. That's what nonprofits can't do. And so at the very least, make sure you're not using overly restrictive grant language. But we also, other things funders can do short of actually direct funding is hosting trainings for their grantees. There's a lot of interesting things that funders are doing in the space that we really try to lift up and encourage through the philanthropy toolkit.
Go ahead, Luis. Do you have thoughts to add?
No, Brian, thank you so much for highlighting all of those components. The other area that I think, at least for Engage San Diego, has played a pivotal role. We've been around for 13 years, and Lizette, I don't want to leave you as the only person who references 2010 campaigns, but 2010 was my first opportunity to really get involved with some of these bigger issue campaigns. And 2011 is when Engage San Diego was founded. These are efforts that have continued. And one of the benefits of philanthropic support is that there is a institutional space where best practices, knowledge and library of resources are housed. So when I talk about the 15 community-based organizations that I work with, those 15 have been around for years, but the staff that work within them have changed. As we've seen in any other space, staffing has changed over the years. Knowledge experts come, they go, and they're able to contribute that knowledge. But the one benefit within our region is that in Engage San Diego, we house that. So we have training videos, best practices. We're able to onboard new staff for our community-based organizations and ensure that they are up to speed with the work that is ahead of them. And that, for me, is directly connected to philanthropy, that they continue to choose to support infrastructure and year-round work. With Engage San Diego, not only are we able to onboard new staff, but we're able to make sure that we continue to learn from our successes and that we cultivate that knowledge of those losses. What are those examples of experimentation that worked and didn't work? And then how do we continue to build off of that? I'm so proud of the 13 years of work that we've accomplished, and I know that there's a strong future ahead of us, and I'm really excited to see what that future looks like. But just because 2024, is an election year, doesn't mean that that's when our work ends. So that's my added sense.
That's great. Thanks for chiming in and adding that. There's one topic that I'd like to introduce in the little bit of time that we have left. And Tracy, why don't you go ahead?
I just wanted to add that what I really appreciate about philanthropy is that those leaders can set the tone and the agenda for local action and local network building. And in terms of urgency the conversation around let's come together and roll our sleeves up, and activating networks, the census outreach networks, and the disaster response networks in this work, and also building on what Brian was saying in terms of simplifying grant requirements. You can also do regranting or funding that unleashes creativity in particular neighborhoods. How let's local folks identify what activities would connect their neighbors to the vote and give them the resources to do that. I hope to see that in Get Out the Vote work this year.
I think that's great, and that dovetails into my final topic, and that is of voting centers and candidate forums. I know that some of our panelists have been very engaged in establishing voting centers and holding candidate forums, and I'd like to ask them to chime in to talk about the difference that establishing voting spaces has made for their communities and constituents.
Yes, I can share, Robert. At Ultimed, since 2020, we've hosted about 60 vote centers at Ultimed. And so we've partnered with the Registrar Recorder County Clerks in LA. And we started partnering with the Registrar of Voters in Orange County to host these voting locations. This past primary, we hosted 15 sites. The really powerful piece about that is that we're going to community where they're at, right? We know that they're going to come into our clinic, right? We know that they're going to come to receive, various services. We have specifically our program for all-inclusive care for the elderly, our PACE sites, see folks who get transported there, who sometimes have limited mobility, who, if we were not to host these vote centers, they likely would not go out to vote themselves to a vote center, or really because the ballot is still confusing, right? We do this all the time as experts here. And I'm sure when we all open up our ballots and see how many pages that is, it's always like, I got to sit down to do it, right? And so we try to increase access to our patients, community, and staff. And so at our PACE sites, we've had just a ton of inspiring stories around our participants voting for the very first time at our sites. I'm happy to share some press clips, with folks where we actually had 2 of our PACE participants who had just become naturalized citizens in time to vote in this primary, and they were very emotional. We took them through the process. We kind of guided them, their caretaker kind of guided them to that vote center, right? And so for us, it's been a matter of access. Same thing for our staff. One of our highest performing vote centers was actually at our what we call Ultimed University, where a lot of the administrative departments work out of. That was our highest performing. Same thing we got, right? I wouldn't have done this because I didn't even know when the election was. And the fact that there's also same-day voter registration is kind of a game changer for a lot of our staff that maybe didn't know that there was an election happening. So we informed them about those pieces as well. And then the last piece that I'll share, we did this really interesting project during the 2022 election for the LA mayoral race. We actually wanted to inform our patients. We didn't know if getting them in a town hall with the candidates was going to work out. And so what we ended up doing is actually asking every candidate questions around social determinants of health. They were asked by one of our doctors. We filmed it all. We partnered with a media agency, and then we did that into we had 5-minute kind of snippets, right, of their answers. We asked them to limit it to 5 minutes, and then we put them in circulation in all of the lobby areas of our clinics in the city of LA, so that if I'm sitting waiting for my doctor, I got to see what does this candidate think about housing, and so we got very creative with how we distribute that information. But education is key and access is key.
That's great. Does anyone else have any bits that they'd like to chime into about voting centers? I know we had a pretty robust discussion in some of our earlier calls.
Chime in really quickly. One of the successes that we've been really proud about in San Diego is every 4 years, the Registrar of Voters, with the implementation of the Voters' Choice Act, is required to do an analysis of where vote centers should be located. So those vote center calculations directly correlated to voter registration and population counts. So one of the things that we have the opportunity to do is we know what region vote centers should be placed in. Then we can advocate for where vote centers should be placed in. Prior to the Voters' Choice Act, what we were seeing is that there were a number of polling locations that were placed in unwelcoming spaces. In communities that were historically over-policed, we were seeing that polling places were placed inside of a police station. And you have this immediate friction within communities who may not have a trusting relationship with police, now being forced to decide, do I go into a police station to have my voice heard, or do I step away in order to protect myself and my community? The inverse of that implementation is we've now actually placed a vote center inside of the San Diego LGBT Community Center. And with the implementation of vote centers, you don't have to go to your local polling place. You can go to any vote center in the county and cast your vote. So we have heard for the last few years, story after story of individuals coming from 10, 15, 30 miles away to go to the San Diego LGBT Community Center to have their voices heard because they feel welcomed, they feel seen, they feel supported. They know that when they walk in, that they themselves as an individual and as a human being will be empowered and have the full support, both of the community-based organization as well as the Registrar of Voters. That creates a system in which communities have true access to democracy and to the ballot box. We're hoping to expand that. Lisette already spoke about what it looks like to have vote centers inside of health centers, but how do we even make that broader? Right now, the Registrar of Voters locally is implementing vote centers in government buildings. We're going to be having a big push in the next few years of how do we make sure that community centers that represent those spaces are the primary option for vote centers. So a victory, and as I said, we've built off of these successes, and I'm really excited to see what comes in the next few years.
Thanks so much, Luis, as are we. This has brought us right up to our time. So I know this was a jam-packed session with lots of information and varying voices on this topic. So I want to make sure that when I send out the follow-up email, I'm going to include all of the resources that we spoke about today and that were included in the chat. We'll make it really easy for you to find these websites, these toolkits, and these important resources from which to draw inspiration or to share with your communities as you form your civic engagement or get out the vote topics. I mean, with that, I'd really like to extend a special thanks to all of our speakers for taking the time today, as well as in the pre-planning for this webinar, to put together a really thoughtful and engaging piece that I think is really of great importance, particularly now, but also as we look forward to the upcoming elections in November. So thanks so much, everyone. Really happy to have you and look forward to partnering with you further in the future.
Thank you, Robert.
Take care.